She stood in the snow, her voice barely louder than the wind. "I don't have a mama. Can I stay one day?" And in that frozen moment, a war-hardened soldier and a quiet single dad were faced with a question neither of them saw coming, but one that would change all three lives forever. If stories of love healing and second chances speak to your heart, don't forget to subscribe. Each week, we bring you true-to-life tales that remind us sometimes the smallest voices ask the biggest questions. Now let's begin. I don't have a mama. Can I spend a day with you, ma'am? The voice was small, but it cut through the snowfall like a flare in the night. Sergeant Riley Hart turned, startled, blinking against the cold. The words hadn't come from behind her, but below. At her feet stood a little girl in a red puffy coat, worn at the elbows, clutching a threadbare teddy bear. Her golden curls were dusted with snow, and her eyes blue wide, and unflinching looked straight into Riley's, like they already knew her. Riley froze. Behind her, the brass band in the square kept playing Silent Night. Families bustled past with cocoa and gifts, laughter echoing under the lights strung across the trees. But here, time narrowed into a stillness she hadn't felt since before the desert. The girl didn't move. Riley swallowed. What did you say? I don't have a mama?" The child repeated, her voice not louder, just clearer. "But I'd like to know what it feels like. Just for one day." Riley's breath caught. For a moment, she forgot the cold. A man appeared then, mid-30s, tall, flannel coat dusted in snow. His boots were scuffed, his beard uneven, but his presence was quiet, solid. He stood a few feet back, hands in his pockets, watching. Not panicked, not rushing, just waiting. Their eyes met. His were the color of worn denim and carried something she recognized: fatigue, restraint, and something quieter beneath trust. "I'm sorry," he said, approaching slowly. "She's not usually like this. I think today just got to her." Riley looked from the girl to the man. "Is she your daughter?" He hesitated. "She's mine," he said. "Not by blood, but she's mine." The little girl tugged at Riley's glove. "Please, just today. I won't ask for forever." That did it. There was something in the way she said just today, like she'd already learned not to hope for anything more. Riley knelt slowly until they were eye to eye. "What's your name, sweetheart Annie?" she whispered. Riley glanced at the man. "I'm Riley." "And you are Caleb," he replied. "Caleb Walker." Riley turned back to Annie, then slowly, as if her hand weighed 100 pounds, she pulled off her glove and extended her palm. "Well, Annie, I'd be honored." Annie slipped her tiny fingers into Riley's with no hesitation, and for the first time in years, Riley Hart, soldier mechanic survivor, felt warmth seep in through a place she thought had gone cold. They walked through the snow-covered market like a trio drawn together by some invisible thread. Annie swung their joined hands with innocent glee. Caleb trailed just slightly behind his eyes, never straying far. "You're home for Christmas?" he asked finally, his voice low and even. "Just a few days," Riley replied. "Stationed out of Fort Campbell. Mechanic," he guessed, nodding toward the patches on her uniform. She arched an eyebrow. "How'd you know I work with my hands?" he said with a faint smile. "I can spot calluses like mine." She chuckled. It was a dry sound, unused, but not unkind. They stopped near a wooden cart selling roasted chestnuts. Annie's nose wrinkled at the steam. "Ice cream," she said suddenly. Riley blinked. "In this weather?" "She doesn't care about weather," Caleb said. "She says ice cream makes the cold taste better." Riley laughed. A real one this time? Annie beamed. They bought 3 cones and sat on a snow-covered bench as the sky deepened to twilight. "You're good with her," Caleb said after a moment. Riley kept her eyes on the little girl. "I've never held a child's hand in my life." He looked at her, studying her silence. "You didn't flinch." "She didn't either," Riley said. Caleb nodded as if that explained something only they both understood. Annie leaned against Riley's arm, sticky with melted vanilla. "You smell like metal and peppermint." Riley blinked. "That is very accurate. She smells like sawdust and cookies," Annie added, nodding toward Caleb. "But he doesn't know how to do princess hair." Riley smiled. "Neither do I." "That's okay," Annie said, yawning. "You can just hold my hand." Riley stared ahead into the crowd, but her voice came quiet. "Maybe we all just need to hold someone's hand once in a while." The words hung there between them, soft, true, almost too intimate for strangers. The brass band finished their final song. People applauded. The Christmas tree lit up in a burst of golden light. Gasps filled the air. But on that bench, the real glow came from somewhere else. Riley looked at Caleb. "She's special," he nodded. "She's strong." "She yours?" she asked again. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at Annie, now curled against Riley's coat, her teddy bear pressed between them. Then he said something Riley would remember for a long time. "She's not mine by name, but she's mine by every heartbeat." For a moment, Riley forgot about the base, the desert, the loss, the silence she'd carried like armor. In the fading light with this man she didn't know, and a little girl who had no reason to trust, something cracked open. Not a wound, a door. And just like that, Unday had already begun to feel like something she might not be able to walk away from. Snowflakes still drifted from the darkening sky. As Riley sat motionless, Annie curled against her side like she belonged there. Caleb sat a few feet away on the same bench, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, elbows resting on his knees. He wasn't crowding them, wasn't interfering, but he wasn't distant either. It was a silence that didn't demand words. Riley looked down at the child resting against her. The little body was warm, trusting. Too trusting. The uniform she wore had withstood explosions, breakdowns, and the 1,000-mile stares of combat medics. But this sleeping 4-year-old on her arm, that was a whole new kind of fragility. "She okay?" Caleb asked quietly. Riley nodded, out like a light. He smiled softly. "Snow and sugar. She won't last long after that." "Does she always walk up to strangers and ask them to be her mom?" Caleb hesitated. "No, that was a first." Riley raised an eyebrow. "You didn't look surprised." He exhaled slow. "I was, just not in the way you think." She studied him now, not just his face, but the stillness beneath it. Not stiff, not shut off, contained, like a man who had learned not to spill over no matter how heavy the storm. "You always this calm when your kid disappears into a soldier's orbit." Caleb chuckled under his breath. "Let's just say I've learned to read people fast. You didn't flinch when she touched you. You didn't pull back. That told me more than words." Riley looked away. "She shouldn't have picked me." "You think she made a mistake? I know she did." Caleb leaned back, folding his arms. "She's 4. She's never been wrong about people. Not once." There was something in his tone, firm like a warning but wrapped in warmth. It didn't accuse, it protected. Besides, he added, "She didn't pick a soldier. She picked a woman sitting alone in a crowd full of families." That hit deeper than she expected. "I wasn't waiting for anyone," Riley muttered. Caleb's smile didn't change. "You don't sit that still, unless you're hoping someone notices." She didn't answer, because he was right. The lights in the park began to brighten as night settled fully in. Children danced past with blinking wands. Parents carried cider in both hands. Couples snuck kisses under lampposts. And here she was, still in her uniform, still gripping a world she swore she'd left behind in dust and gunpowder. still letting it keep her from things like this. You said she's not yours by blood, Riley said finally. But she's yours. Caleb nodded once. You find her. More like, she found me, he said, his voice softening. Christmas morning, 3 years ago, basket on the porch, no name, no note, just a baby and a bottle. Riley's eyes widened. I was just the guy fixing a roof for a widow next door. She thought I lived there. Knocked on the wrong door, I guess. He shrugged. I called child services. But they were short-staffed. Holidays. Said they'd send someone. Hours passed. She cried. I held her. He looked at Riley now, and by the time someone finally showed up, she'd fallen asleep on my chest. I told them I'd take care of her, just for the night. Riley's throat tightened. She couldn't explain why. Next day, Caleb went on. They came back with papers. I signed them. I didn't plan to. But she stayed. She stayed, he said simply. Riley turned to Annie again. Her fingers had gone slack around the stuffed bear's neck. Her breath rose and fell in a steady rhythm. She calls you Papa. Caleb nodded. Took a while? But yeah. One day she said it like she always had. Riley lowered her eyes. You're braver than I am, Caleb scoffed. That's funny coming from someone with a combat patch and a Bronze Star. I know how to rebuild an engine under fire. That doesn't mean I know how to hold something fragile without breaking it. Then maybe, he said gently, this was your turn to be held. Riley looked at him, and for the first time in months, her instinct wasn't to look away. His gaze was steady kind, but not intrusive. She could feel the way he saw her, not the uniform, not the edges, but something buried, nearly forgotten. Before she could reply, Annie stirred. Papa, she murmured without opening her eyes. I'm right here, baby, Caleb said, reaching over and brushing a curl from her cheek. Can we take her with us? Annie mumbled. Mama Riley. Riley stiffened, but Caleb only looked at her, a silent question in his eyes. She's tired, Riley said quickly. Kids say things. She doesn't, Caleb replied. She asks. Riley glanced down. Annie was still asleep, lips parted slightly, fingers tangled in the wool of her uniform. She didn't realize her own hand had moved until she felt it smoothing the child's coat. I should probably get going, she said, her voice low. Caleb nodded slowly. Of course. Riley began to shift, but Annie whimpered. No, she whispered. Don't go yet. Caleb hesitated. You live nearby. Not far. Base housing. But I've got a hotel tonight. My leave starts officially tomorrow. He nodded again. My truck's just down the road, if you wanted a ride. She looked at him surprised. I thought I was the stranger. You were, he said with a half smile. But something tells me you're not anymore. Riley glanced at Annie, then back at Caleb, then toward the parking lot. She stood Annie still nestled against her, and for reasons she couldn't explain, she didn't put the child down. All right, she said softly. Let's walk. And the three of them strangers, just hours before, made their way through the park, beneath twinkling lights, the crunch of snow beneath their feet, and the beginning of something none of them could name yet. But they could feel it. And somehow, that was enough. The wind had picked up by the time they reached the parking lot, blowing loose snow in shimmering swirls across the pavement. Riley opened the passenger door of Caleb's pickup, careful not to wake Annie, who had drifted back into a soft doze in her arms. She laid the little girl across the back seat, gently tucking the fuzzy bear under her arm and fastening the seatbelt around the both of them with practiced hands. She trusts you, Caleb said, his voice quiet in the cold. Riley hesitated, her hand still resting on the seatbelt buckle. I didn't earn it. Caleb didn't respond right away, just shut the driver's door softly and started the engine. The heater groaned to life, and the truck filled with the smell of pine and engine grease. Simple things. Warm things. You don't have to earn everything, he said, eventually backing out of the parking space. Riley turned to look out the window. The town passed by in soft blurs. Lit porches, snow-tipped fences, the kind of neighborhood that looked like a greeting card. Yet she could feel the weight of Annie's head still on her shoulder, as if that trust hadn't let go yet. "I should get a hotel," Riley murmured. "There's one over by the interstate," Caleb replied. Or, she turned to him. He kept his eyes on the road. "Or, I've got a guest room. It's not fancy, but it's warm and safe." She studied his face. "You always invite strangers into your home." He smiled faintly. "Only the ones who hold my kid like she's made of stars." That stopped her. He didn't say like she's fragile. He didn't say like she's yours. Like she's made of stars. That was something else entirely. Caleb's house sat on the edge of town, where street lamps faded into long shadows and pine trees lined the gravel drive. It wasn't big. A one-story fixer-upper with wood siding a crooked mailbox and Christmas lights strung like someone had let a child direct the placement. Inside, the warmth wrapped around her immediately. Not just the heat from the old radiator near the kitchen, but the kind of warmth that came from living. Handmade bookshelves bowed with weight. A stack of half-carved wooden toys on the coffee table. A Christmas tree stood in the corner, unevenly decorated, Annie's touch unmistakable. She insisted on putting all the angel ornaments on one side, Caleb said, seeing her notice. I didn't argue. "She's got style," Riley replied. He disappeared into the hallway to fetch blankets. Riley set Annie gently on the couch. The little girl murmured something in her sleep and curled instinctively toward the pillow, one arm still cradling her bare like a shield. Riley stayed there for a moment, crouched beside her, fingers resting on the edge of the blanket. She didn't know what she was doing. She'd fought off IEDs, disassembled a diesel engine in 45 minutes flat under fire, patched up Humvees in sandstorms. But now she was in a stranger's house, heart hammering like she'd just been dropped into unknown territory without a map. Caleb returned with a pillow and a faded quilt. "You want the guest room?" Riley stood slowly. "If it's not too much trouble." He shook his head. "Not at all." He led her down the short hallway and pushed open a door at the end. The room was small but clean. Wood-paneled walls, a dresser with chipped knobs. A framed photo of a sailboat hung slightly crooked over the bed. "I keep meaning to fix that frame," Caleb muttered. She smiled. "Leave it. It's got character." He lingered in the doorway. "There's extra towels in the bathroom. If you need anything." "Just knock." She nodded. "Thanks, Caleb." He hesitated, then stepped back and closed the door behind him with a soft click. Riley stood there for a long minute staring at the bed. She didn't lie down. Instead, she crossed the room, pulled the curtain aside, and looked out into the quiet night. Snow continued to fall. The porch light cast a soft circle of gold onto the white-covered ground. She thought of Annie's voice in the park. "I just want to know what it feels like." To hold a mama's hand, she pressed her palm lightly to the window. That little girl didn't know what she'd done, and somehow that made it even harder to bear. Later that night, after the house had gone still, Riley stepped into the kitchen for water. The dim overhead light glowed softly, illuminating the sink full of hand-washed dishes, a drying rack stacked with plastic cups and wooden spoons. She turned and found Caleb sitting at the kitchen table barefoot, nursing a mug of coffee. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. "Didn't try." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Join the club." She slid into the seat. He pushed a second mug toward her. Steam rose gently from the rim. "I only have regular," he said. "No fancy roasts." She wrapped her hands around it anyway. "It's perfect." They sat in quiet for a while. Finally, she asked, "Why didn't you call someone else when you found her?" Caleb looked into his mug. "I did," he said. At first, child services, the sheriff, even the local church. But the calls kept going to voicemail. Christmas morning, everyone busy with their own kids. He looked up, his eyes steady, and I had this baby in my arms, crying like she'd never been held right. I couldn't put her down. Riley said nothing. I thought it would be one night, he continued. Just one. But the next morning, I woke up, and she was still there. And for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like I was waking up alone. Riley's throat tightened. "You think I'm crazy?" he asked softly. "No," she said. "I think you're the kind of man people don't write enough stories about." Caleb's eyes held hers for a long beat. "Then maybe you're the kind of woman who should be in more of them," he said. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was full, heavy, hopeful. And when Riley finally rose to go back to her room, she didn't feel like a guest anymore. She felt like someone who'd just stepped into the beginning of something real. The smell of bacon and maple syrup crept under the guest room door, pulling Riley from the shallow sleep she hadn't expected to find. For a moment, she lay still in the unfamiliar bed, eyes tracing the grain of the wooden ceiling, listening. Laughter. Small and unfiltered. Annie. And a man's voice, steady, warm, amused. "Caleb." Riley sat up, brushing her hair back and pulling on her sweatshirt. She padded barefoot down the hall, the hardwood floors creaking under her steps. She stopped at the doorway to the kitchen. Caleb stood at the stove in flannel pajama pants and a thermal shirt, flipping pancakes like a pro. Annie sat on the counter beside him, her feet swinging, clutching a wooden spoon like a microphone. "Jingle bells. Pancakes smell. Papa burns the toast," she sang. I heard that Caleb said, tossing her a mock glare over his shoulder. I rhymed. Annie beamed proudly. "You did," he admitted, plating the next batch with a grin. Riley cleared her throat gently. They both turned. Annie's face lit up. "Mama Riley." Riley froze. So did Caleb. Annie hopped down from the counter and ran to her arms, wrapping tightly around Riley's leg. Riley blinked, unsure where to place her hands. "I made up a song," Annie announced. I heard Riley said, brushing the little girl's hair back with surprising ease. "Instant classic." Caleb approached with a plate. "Coffee always." They sat at the kitchen table. Annie bounced between bites of pancake and stories that veered off in 3 directions at once. Caleb listened, like each sentence mattered, correcting her gently when she skipped the ending, letting her shine. Riley didn't speak much. She was watching, absorbing, trying not to feel the ache building in her chest. "You okay?" Caleb asked quietly, once Annie had dashed off to the living room to dig through her crayon box. Riley looked down at her fork. "It's been a long time since I've sat at a table like this. You've got family." She hesitated. Had. Caleb waited, patient. He never pushed. That was something she hadn't known how much she needed until now. "My sister Abby," she said eventually. "She was 4 years younger, always tagging along. Drove me nuts when we were kids." Her voice softened. "I joined the army first. She followed later. Said if I could do it, she could too." Caleb leaned in slightly but said nothing. "Last year she was deployed in my unit. We were both on a convoy detail." Riley paused, gripping her coffee tighter. "The Humvee she rode in shouldn't have gone out that night. I'd just finished maintenance on it. There was a report of a wiring issue in the comms. I was going to flag it for downtime the next morning." Her jaw tightened, but orders came down to move. Chain of command said clear it. They left anyway. She drew in a breath. They hit an IED on the outskirts of Mosul. 3 casualties. Abby didn't make it. Caleb's voice was gentle. "You blame yourself. I was the mechanic. I was supposed to keep her safe." She looked up, her eyes hard but rimmed with pain. "I fix things, Caleb. That's my job. Bolts, brakes, engines. I couldn't fix her." Silence hung heavy for a moment. Then Caleb leaned forward, voice low. "Riley, I'm a woodworker. I fix broken chairs, loose stair rails. But when Annie showed up on my porch, I didn't know the first thing about raising a child. I didn't know how to sterilize a bottle or what kind of cry meant hunger and which meant fear." He glanced toward the living room where Annie hummed to herself on the floor. "I didn't fix her. I just didn't leave." Riley blinked. Caleb continued, "There's a difference between carrying blame and carrying love. One will bury you. The other will rebuild you." She looked down, her fingers resting on the rim of her mug. "Sometimes I think maybe I wasn't meant for anything softer than war." "Funny," Caleb said, "because Annie thinks you're exactly what softness looks like." That silenced her. Before she could reply, Annie came barreling in holding a crayon drawing. "It's us," she announced proudly. She slapped the picture onto the table. 3 stick figures stood under a crooked Christmas tree. One wore a triangle dress. One had a long rectangle body and a smile. The smallest one had a giant heart on her chest. "That's me," Annie said, pointing. "And that's Papa. And that's Mama Riley." Riley looked at the drawing. Her throat felt tight. "You gave me brown boots," Caleb noted. Annie nodded. "You always wear brown boots." "What about me?" Riley asked, trying to smile. "You're holding my hand," Annie said simply. Riley couldn't speak. Caleb's voice broke the stillness. "Looks like you're part of the family now." Riley looked at him sharply. "Not pressure," he said quickly. "Just an observation. A 4-year-old's declaration has been known to change fates before. I'm only here for a couple of days," Riley said. "I know," Caleb replied. "Still." He paused. Riley tilted her head. "Still what?" He gave her a long, steady look. "Still feels like you were supposed to walk into that park last night." She didn't answer. Not because she disagreed, but because deep down she was starting to believe it too. The sun had dropped behind the tree line, casting long lavender shadows over the snow-covered yard. Inside the cozy house, the scent of pine and cinnamon lingered in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of wood glue and sawdust from Caleb's workroom. Riley stood at the kitchen counter, sleeves rolled up, carefully helping Annie press cookie cutters into rolled dough. Hearts, stars, trees, none of them came out quite right, but Annie beamed with pride at every shape. "Stars don't have to be perfect," she declared. "They just have to shine." Riley smiled. "You're a philosopher now." Annie tilted her head. "What's that?" "Someone who says things that make people feel things," Riley said, brushing flour off the little girl's cheek. Annie considered that. "Then yes, I'm that." Caleb chuckled from the kitchen table, sanding down the edge of a wooden rocking horse. "She gets that from my side." "You have philosophers in your family?" Riley asked. "Nope," Caleb said, "but we're real good at saying things we don't fully understand." Annie giggled, her hands now dusted white. "Mama Riley's better at baking than Papa." Riley froze. Caleb's hand paused mid-stroke. Annie didn't notice. She picked up a candy cane-shaped cutter and kept going, humming a tune that sounded suspiciously like the national anthem, but with cookie-related lyrics. Riley recovered first, stepping aside to place a tray in the oven. Her voice was light, but forced. "That's a big title, sweetheart." "Mama Riley." Annie looked up, completely serious. "Is it okay I call you that?" "You feel like Mama in my heart." The words dropped like snow on warm skin, silent, sudden, and impossible to ignore. Riley knelt beside her. "Annie, I'm not trying to take anything from you." "You're not taking," Annie said simply. "You're just being." Caleb stood now, setting down the sandpaper. Riley looked up at him, her heart pounding in ways she didn't have training for. "I can talk to her," he offered quietly. "Explain things." But Riley shook her head. "No, she feels something. You don't explain that away." They both looked at Annie, who had already moved on to decorating a crooked tree with too many gumdrops. Riley stood. "This is starting to feel bigger than a few cookies." Caleb leaned against the wall, arms crossed. It was never just cookies. He said it with a soft smile, but his eyes searched hers quietly, asking a question he wasn't sure he had the right to ask. And Riley, who could fix broken metal and tighten bolts on a moving convoy, had no idea how to answer. That night, after Annie had fallen asleep on the couch with frosting in her hair and glitter stuck to her socks, Riley stepped outside. The cold slapped her face like truth, sharp and clean. She leaned on the porch railing, watching snowflakes dance in the glow of the porch light. Behind her, the house was warm and full of something that felt too much like home. It was dangerous. "You always disappear when things get quiet," Caleb's voice came from behind her. Riley didn't turn around. Noise is easier. He stepped beside her, holding out a thick quilt. She didn't take it, so he laid it gently around her shoulders. "You're scared," he said plainly. She exhaled her breath, blooming into the night air. "Of what? Of what you feel?" Riley shook her head. "I'm not supposed to feel this," says the woman who buried her sister and never got to say goodbye. Says the soldier who still wakes up at 3 a.m., wondering if she tightened the right bolt. Says the mechanic who's only ever been good with machines because machines don't need you to be soft. Caleb didn't interrupt. "They don't look at you like you might leave," she added, voice cracking. "Or worse, like they want you to stay." The porch creaked as Caleb shifted his weight. "You ever think maybe staying is the bravest thing you could do?" She turned toward him, eyes shining. "You don't know what it's like to fail someone you love." "I do," he said. "I just don't talk about it much." That silenced her. Caleb leaned on the railing next to her. Before Annie, there was a woman. Long-term. Laughed like jazz music. "I thought we were headed somewhere." "What happened?" She didn't want the small-town life. Didn't want quiet or kids or sawdust on her clothes. Said I was good, but not enough. Riley stared at him. "I'm sorry." He shrugged. She left. And I learned to be okay with the echo. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Caleb said softly, "Until one Christmas morning, someone left a baby on my porch. No name, no instructions, just this tiny human, and a note that said, 'Please don't hate her.'" Riley swallowed hard. "You didn't." "No, I loved her." He turned toward her fully. "And when she called you Mama Riley today, you didn't flinch. That's more than most would do." Riley looked down. "I didn't expect to feel anything." Caleb stepped closer. "And yet, here you are. Feeling." She looked up at him close now, closer than before. "I was only supposed to stay a day," she whispered. He nodded, voice barely audible. "Then maybe we just make today last a little longer." The silence stretched deep and warm. Then a small knock broke it. They turned. Annie stood barefoot in the doorway, holding her teddy bear and blinking sleepily. "I had a dream you left," she said to Riley. Riley dropped to one knee. "Sweetheart, I'm right here." Annie's eyes filled. "Promise." Riley hesitated, just for a beat. "Then I promise." Annie ran to her and wrapped her arms around Riley's neck. Caleb watched his hand resting on the doorframe, eyes glistening. And just like that, what was meant to be one day started to feel like something far more permanent. Something called family. The next morning, the smell of rain-dampened snow clung to the windows as Riley stood in front of the hallway mirror, her duffel bag at her feet. Her leave technically began today, but the uniform still clung to her body, like a second skin, neatly pressed, sharply creased everything she knew how to control, everything she trusted. Behind her, the sounds of soft footsteps padded down the hall. "Where you going?" Annie's voice came sleepily from the doorway. She wore footy pajamas with faded rocket ships, and her curls were mashed to one side like a tiny tornado had passed through her dreams. Riley turned, caught mid-motion with her coat half-buttoned, just stepping out for a bit. Annie blinked. "Can I come?" Riley hesitated. Not this time. The girl's shoulders drooped. "Is it 'cause I called you Mama?" The words hit like a well-placed blow. Riley knelt, setting her bag aside. "No, baby girl. Not because of that." Annie stared at her a moment longer, then wrapped her arms tightly around Riley's neck. "I'll wait here." Riley closed her eyes. "Okay." Caleb stood in the kitchen doorway as Riley walked down the front steps. He hadn't asked where she was going. He didn't need to. But when she reached the driveway, his voice followed her. "Don't disappear without saying goodbye." She turned. "I'm not disappearing." He nodded slowly. "You're just leaving the light on in case you change your mind." Riley didn't answer. She simply turned toward the truck and drove. She sat alone in the corner booth of the only cafe still open past 9 a.m. The waitress, a kind-eyed woman in her 60s, poured her coffee with a knowing smile, but didn't ask questions. Riley appreciated that. Outside, the snow had thinned to flurries, and the town had resumed its holiday rhythm. Children in coats. Two big old men playing checkers outside the hardware store. Couples holding mittens instead of hands. Riley stared into her mug. She hadn't meant to feel anything. That was the rule. You land, you visit, you retreat. No attachments, no complications. Especially not with people like Caleb Walker, men with soft voices and steady hands. Men who built rocking horses and held little girls like they were made of sunlight. And certainly not with Annie, a child who had somehow crawled into her chest and planted something there that was growing too fast, too warm. The bell above the cafe door jingled. Riley didn't look up until a familiar voice said, "Mind if I sit?" Caleb stood there, snow-dusting his coat, a to-go cup in his hand. She nodded silently. He slid into the booth across from her and waited a moment before speaking. "She's on the couch," he said quietly. "Drew a picture of you with wings." Riley huffed a small breath. "I'm not an angel. She thinks you are. She's 4. She's 4, he agreed, but she's been through more than most adults. She knows what safe feels like." Riley swallowed hard. Caleb leaned forward. "What are you running from?" "I'm not running." He raised an eyebrow. "Then what's this? I just needed space. To breathe or to bolt." She looked down at the chipped edge of the table. "I can't be what she wants." "You already are." "No," Riley said firmly. "I'm not soft. I'm not nurturing. I'm a gearhead with scars and bad habits, and more baggage than your attic could hold." Caleb's voice was steady. "You know what Annie needs." Riley didn't respond. "She needs someone who sees her, who doesn't make her feel like she has to earn love. Someone who stays." Riley flinched. "That's the problem, Caleb. I don't know if I can stay. I don't know what that looks like." He leaned back, arms folded. "Then let me show you. Let us show you." The silence stretched. Finally, Riley asked, "What if I stay and mess it all up?" He gave a sad, quiet smile. "What if you stay and don't?" The house was dark when Riley returned that evening. The porch light flickered on as she stepped into its circle. She hesitated, then knocked. The door opened almost instantly. Annie stood there, her eyes wide with hope, blanket around her shoulders like a cape. Behind her, the Christmas tree glowed faintly. "You came back," she whispered. Riley's throat tightened. "Yeah, I did." Annie stepped aside, and Riley entered, like a soldier stepping onto sacred ground. Caleb appeared from the hallway. He didn't smile, didn't speak, just gave her that same steady look, like he was still holding space for her, and would keep holding it as long as she needed. Riley knelt down and opened her arms. Annie ran into them all, warmth and weight and forgiveness. "I thought maybe you changed your mind," she whispered. Riley held her tighter. "I did." Caleb watched them from a few steps away, heart full, and breaking all at once, because in that moment, without a single declaration or promise, a little girl with a heart too big and a woman with walls too high had made each other a home. And just like that, the fear of leaving became the reason to stay. The snow returned with a vengeance that night, thick and fast, muting the world in white. By morning, it was a different town. Altogether, buried sidewalks, drifting fences, car hoods swallowed whole. The kind of snow that made the world quiet and dangerous. Inside Caleb's home, the silence was not peaceful. It was tight, tense. Annie lay on the couch, her cheeks flushed a deep, unsettling red, her tiny body wrapped in a knitted quilt. Her teddy bear, usually clutched to her chest, had been tossed aside, forgotten. She wasn't humming. She wasn't coloring. She was still. Too still. Caleb stood over her brow, furrowed the back of his hand, pressed to her forehead for the 5th time in an hour. Still burning up. Riley hovered near the kitchen table, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "You gave her Tylenol 2 hours ago," Caleb said. "Didn't touch it." She crossed the room, kneeling beside the couch. "Hey, Annie. You with us, sweetheart?" The little girl blinked slowly. Her voice was barely a whisper. "My tummy hurts." Caleb moved toward the phone. "I'm calling the clinic." Riley followed him. "In this storm, I don't care," he said, already dialing. "She needs help." The phone rang once, twice, then static. Caleb tried again. Nothing. "Lines are down," he muttered, gripping the receiver like it had personally failed him. Riley's jaw clenched. There's gotta be another way. He looked out the window. Snow was falling sideways, the wind howling like something alive. "I'm taking her in," he said. "Caleb, the roads." "Then I'll walk." Riley grabbed his arm. "You can't carry a 4-year-old through a blizzard. I've carried more through worse. And what if you don't make it? What if she doesn't?" He turned to her, eyes blazing. "Then give me another option." She didn't have one, because sometimes even soldiers run out of backup. 15 minutes later, Caleb emerged from the back bedroom wrapped in layers thermal flannel wool, his old work coat zipped to his chin. Riley stood by the door, holding a bundle of blanket scarves and a hot water bottle tucked under her arm like a mission pack. "She's ready," she said. He nodded and moved to the couch, gently gathering Annie into his arms. The child whimpered her head, lolling against his shoulder. Caleb kissed her temple. "Hang on, baby. We're gonna make you feel better." Riley opened the door, and the wind slammed into them like a wall. "I'll be back as soon as I can," he said over the roar. Riley grabbed his arm once more, harder this time. "No," she said. "You won't." Caleb blinked at her. "You're not going alone." The walk to the urgent care center was less than a mile, but in a storm like this, it may as well have been Everest. They took turns carrying Annie, shielding her face from the wind, wrapping their bodies around her as the snow lashed, and the cold bit through even their thickest layers. Riley moved like a machine, precise, controlled, but her eyes never left the child in Caleb's arms. Annie whimpered once, then went silent again. That silence terrified Riley more than any gunfire ever had. "Almost there," Caleb shouted. "Keep moving." By the time they reached the glass doors of the clinic, their fingers were numb. Boots. Soaked cheeks raw. Caleb kicked the door 3 times before it swung open, revealing a nurse in scrubs and snow boots, her eyes widening at the sight of the bundle in Caleb's arms. "Room 3, she barked. Now they followed her inside, as others rushed in thermometer, pulse, oximeter, warm blankets. Riley stood frozen at the edge of the room as they worked. Monitors beeped. The nurse murmured numbers into a headset. A doctor entered, glanced over the chart, and gave orders. "She's stable," he said after several minutes. "But barely. The fever's been too high for too long. We're getting fluids in her now. You got her here just in time." Caleb sank into the nearest chair, burying his face in his hands. Riley didn't sit. She walked slowly to the bedside, where Annie now lay. Cheeks still flushed, but chest rising more steadily under the soft white blanket. She reached out, touched her hand. The girl stirred and whispered, "Mama Riley." Riley turned away quickly, one hand pressed over her mouth, eyes flooding before she could stop them. Caleb stood behind her a moment later, placing a hand on her shoulder. "She asked for you before we left," he said quietly. Riley nodded, unable to speak. "I didn't want to tell you," he continued, voice thick. "Didn't want to make this harder." She turned toward him then. "It's already hard, I know." They stood there, silent, watching the child they both now loved fight her fever with the fragile strength only children seem to possess. After a long moment, Caleb spoke again. "I was afraid she'd love you more." Riley looked at him, startled. He smiled, tired and sad. "But now I know. Maybe she doesn't have to choose." Riley reached for his hand without thinking. Their fingers tangled unspoken truths, passing between them in the warmth of that simple touch. And in that moment, beneath the hum of machines and the soft rhythm of Annie's breathing, they realized what they'd built wasn't just temporary. It was family. Not by blood, not by plan, but by choice. And that kind of love, it stays. The wind had calmed by morning, leaving the town hushed under a quilt of snow. White blanketed the trees, the rooflines, even the old church bell tower downtown frozen in silence, like the world was holding its breath. Inside the clinic, the beeping of monitors had faded into a steady, comforting rhythm. Annie stirred beneath her warm blanket, her little fingers curling around the hospital bunny they'd given her during the night. Caleb sat beside her bed, elbows on his knees, face in his hands. His flannel shirt was wrinkled damp at the hem from yesterday's storm. He hadn't moved much in hours. Riley returned with 2 cups of coffee and a croissant she'd split in half. "You need something," she said, gently, placing 1 cup beside him. He looked up slowly, eyes tired but soft. "You didn't have to stay." "I know," she replied. "But I wanted to." She settled into the chair beside him. "She's sleeping better." He nodded, colors back in her cheeks. They sat in silence a moment. Then Riley added almost too softly, "I've seen grown men go under faster than that little girl." Caleb's mouth twitched into a crooked smile. "She's tough, gets it from her mother." Riley tilted her head. "You never talk about her." He let out a slow breath. "There's not much to say. We were young. She didn't stick around long after Annie was born. Said she wasn't made for small towns or sleepless nights." Riley looked toward the child sleeping in the bed. "And you stayed. I didn't have a choice." Caleb said, his voice firm but without bitterness. "She needed someone. And I wasn't about to let her grow up thinking love was something that walked away." Riley stared at him for a long moment. "You ever resent it?" He looked surprised. "Not for a second." "It's the best thing I've ever done." Her voice was quieter now. "Even though it's cost you things," he met her gaze directly. "The things I lost weren't worth keeping." Riley felt her throat tighten. That answer, it stayed with her. Outside, sunlight filtered through the clouds, casting a soft glow on the snow-covered streets. The nurse poked her head in. Doctor says she can go home by tomorrow if the fever stays down. But she'll need rest, warmth, fluids, and people who care. Caleb gave a tired nod. We've got that covered. The nurse smiled. Looks like you do. Later that afternoon, while Annie slept, Riley stepped outside for air. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a few salt-stained pickups and a snowplow parked haphazardly by the entrance. She leaned against the railing and let the cold nip at her cheeks. She wasn't used to this kind of quiet. Back on base, there were always drills calls, urgency. Here, there was only the sound of her own breath and the memory of small hands reaching for hers. The door creaked behind her. "You okay?" Caleb asked, stepping beside her. "Yeah." She glanced sideways, just thinking. He nodded, watching the horizon. "You look like someone standing on a bridge." She frowned. "What kind of bridge? The kind where you either walk back or forward?" She smiled just a little. "You always talk like a poem." "Only when I don't know what I'm doing," he said with a shrug. They both laughed soft, unsure but real. She turned to face him. "I wasn't supposed to be here this long." "I know. I was supposed to come fix up some things, check on the property and leave." He nodded. "You've got a life somewhere else." Riley looked away. "Yeah, that's the thing. I do. But lately I'm not sure if that life has me." He didn't push, just waited. Finally, she said, "Being here, it's hard to explain. It's like I walked into a house I didn't know I missed until I saw the door again." Caleb was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You don't have to decide today, or tomorrow. But I think maybe this house could use another key." Her eyes searched his, surprised by the steadiness, the gentleness. "You'd do that," she whispered. "Just let me stay," he smiled. "You've already stayed, Riley. Now you just need to unpack." That night, they returned home from the clinic. Caleb carried Annie inside, who was still drowsy, but better asking softly for soup and cartoons. Riley helped settle her on the couch, tucking the quilt around her shoulders. While Caleb went to warm broth on the stove, Riley sat beside Annie. The little girl reached for her hand. "Are you still my soldier?" Riley nodded, emotion catching in her throat. "Always." "Good," Annie said, eyes fluttering, "because soldiers don't leave people behind." Riley swallowed the lump rising in her chest. "No," she whispered. "They don't." Annie drifted off to sleep moments later, peaceful and safe. And for the first time in a long time, Riley's heart felt like maybe, just maybe, she was finally where she belonged. Not on a battlefield, not at the edge of a mission, but in a little town wrapped in snow, in a house full of quiet love, in a place she could finally call home. It started with a draft. Riley noticed it first, a sudden brush of cold air curling down the hallway as she was folding laundry in the upstairs bedroom. She checked the window. Closed. Then the vents. Still warm. Curious, she followed the chill to the narrow pull-down attic stairs at the end of the hall. A faint creak sounded overhead. She glanced down the hall toward Caleb, who was downstairs on the couch, with Annie reading from an old, worn-out picture book. "Back in a sec," she called. He waved without looking up. The little girl curled against him like a kitten. The attic groaned as Riley climbed into it, flashlight in hand. The smell hit her first cedar dust and the musty scent of old paper and fabric that hadn't breathed fresh air in years. She swept the beam of light across the cramped space. It was mostly forgotten things, holiday boxes, a vintage baby crib, a guitar case with a broken latch, and a trunk. Old, dented and banded in leather, its brass clasp had tarnished to green. She hesitated a moment, then clicked it open. Inside were neatly folded military uniforms, men's from another time. a pair of worn boots, some yellowed photographs of a man in dress blues standing beside a young woman in a summer dress. Beneath that, a bundle of letters wrapped with twine. Riley sat down, slowly dust motes, dancing in the flashlight beam as she untied the bundle. The top letter was addressed in tight, cursive handwriting. "To my son, when you're ready to understand." She looked down at the signature at the bottom. William Dalton, Caleb's father. Her heart fluttered slightly as she opened the envelope, unfolding the single-page letter inside. "Son, if you're reading this, I guess I'm long gone. I wasn't much of a father, and for that I've lived with more regret than any man should. I never told you what really happened the day I left. Maybe I thought you'd be better off hating me than knowing the truth, but the truth matters now. I left because I couldn't bear to let you see me sick. The war didn't just take my hearing, it took my pride. My hands shook. My memory was slipping, and I was scared. Not of death, but of becoming a burden. Your mother begged me to stay, but I walked anyway. I know you raised yourself more than I ever raised you. I know you became a better man than I ever was. If you're a father now, I hope you're doing everything I never could. And if by some miracle you're reading this with someone beside you, someone who loves you, don't shut them out. Don't run like I did. You still have time to choose differently. All my love, Dad." Riley sat frozen. The attic was still the wind outside, muffled by snow and time. A choice. That's what this was. A man's last attempt to make peace with his son, and maybe somehow to shape the legacy he'd left behind. She gently replaced the letter in its envelope, hands trembling, and stood. It was time, Caleb knew. Downstairs, the fire had burned low. Annie had fallen asleep again, curled against Caleb's chest. He looked up as Riley entered, his expression shifting as soon as he saw her face. "What is it?" She sat beside him and handed him the letter. He read it without a word. By the end, his eyes were damp. Not from sobs, Caleb didn't cry like that, but from the kind of deep ache that pressed behind the ribs and didn't let go. "He never said any of this," he murmured. "All my life, I thought." He trailed off, hands shaking slightly as he folded the letter again. Riley placed her hand over his. "You thought he abandoned you," she said. "But he thought he was sparing you. I hated him for leaving. And now I still hate that he left," Caleb said. "But maybe I finally understand why." The room was quiet except for the crackling of the last logs in the fireplace. Riley looked down at Annie, her small hand clutching Caleb's shirt in her sleep. "We all carry ghosts," she whispered, "but maybe it's time you stop carrying his." Caleb looked at her eyes, tired and raw, but somehow lighter. "You really staying, Riley?" She met his gaze. "I found my reason." He searched her face for something. "I don't want you to stay because you feel sorry for us," he said softly. "Or because of Annie." She reached out and brushed his hair from his forehead. "I'm not staying because of Annie." He blinked. "I'm staying because of you." His voice was rough when he spoke again. "Then I won't ask you to leave." They sat in silence for a while, the letter on the coffee table like a bridge between generations, between regret and redemption. Outside, the snow had finally stopped. Inside, something had shifted. Not broken, not fallen, but settled. A home no longer haunted. A man no longer alone. A woman no longer lost. And a little girl finally safe, wrapped in arms that would never let go. The snow had started to melt. Not fast, not enough to reveal the roads or the dying grass beneath the drifts, but enough that you could hear it. The slow, steady drip from the eaves, the gentle patter of thawing icicles tapping the windows like quiet reminders that winter didn't last forever. Riley stood at the kitchen sink, sleeves rolled up, rinsing dishes by hand, even though the dishwasher worked fine. Caleb watched her from the doorway, arms folded across his chest. There was something about the way she moved, precise, quiet, like she belonged in that kitchen. Like she'd been there 1,000 mornings before. "You always this thorough?" he asked with a faint smile. She looked over her shoulder. "Comes with the job. Clean lines, tight corners, attention to detail." He stepped forward. "You know this isn't a barracks, right? You can let things sit in the sink once in a while." She turned off the tap and dried her hands. "I know. It's just..." Her voice dropped. "Habit makes me feel like I'm still in control." Caleb leaned against the counter watching her. "You ever think you'll go back?" he asked. Riley hesitated, eyes flickering to the window. Outside, Annie was bundled up in a red coat and knit hat, building a lopsided snow fort in the front yard. "I used to think I had to," she said. "Like if I didn't finish what I started, it meant I'd failed." And now she met his gaze. "Now I'm not sure if finishing means going back or starting something new." A silence stretched between them, filled only by the soft hum of the heater and the child's laughter outside. Caleb cleared his throat. "I was gonna wait, but I think you should see something." He disappeared into the hall closet and returned with a small wooden box. The corners were worn, the brass clasp polished smooth from use. He opened it and handed her a folded paper. Riley unfolded it and froze. Her name, typed. Official. Signed. A military commendation. Sigart. Riley Hart, honorable discharge request approved. Her hands trembled slightly. "How did you get this?" "I called someone I knew in your chain of command," Caleb said. "I asked them to expedite your paperwork, assuming it's what you wanted." Riley stared at him. "You don't get to decide for me." "I didn't. I just made sure the door was open." She set the paper down gently on the counter. "You always fix people's broken engines without asking." He shrugged. "Only when they're worth keeping around." Her voice softened. "That's a dangerous kind of hope." He looked at her seriously. "I've been running this whole place on dangerous hope for years." She laughed, quiet and real. Then her expression turned solemn. "I don't know what the next chapter looks like," she said. "I'm not used to writing one that doesn't come with orders." "Then don't write it alone," Caleb said. Their eyes met, steady searching. There was no grand declaration, no sweeping kiss, just the kind of look that said, "I'm here, I'm not leaving, and I don't expect you to carry it all alone anymore." That night, after Annie had gone to bed and the fireplace had burned low, Riley sat with a notebook in her lap, and Caleb beside her, tuning the old guitar from the attic. She spoke quietly. "There's something I never told you." He looked up. "The last mission I was on wasn't supposed to end the way it did." He waited. "I lost a friend. We were clearing a village routine sweep. He turned to help a kid that ran out of nowhere, and he took the blast instead of me." Her fingers dug into the page. "I kept seeing his face, kept hearing the sound. That's why I came out here, not just for the house. I was trying to outrun the guilt." Caleb set the guitar down gently. "You weren't running," he said. "You were healing. There's a difference." She turned her face toward the firelight. "I don't know if I deserve to be happy." "You don't earn happiness," he said. "You accept it when it finally shows up." She swallowed hard. "You showed up," she whispered. "And I'm not going anywhere." Before bed, Riley walked into Annie's room. The little girl was asleep, curled up with the dragon plush and a paperback tucked under her pillow. Riley pulled the blanket higher, then paused, gently smoothing the girl's golden hair. As she turned to leave, a soft voice called out, "Riley." She turned. Annie blinked at her. "You're not leaving tomorrow, are you?" Riley's throat tightened. "No, sweetheart. I'm not." "Good." Annie yawned. "'Cause this house feels better when you're in it?" Riley knelt beside the bed. "Then I guess this house has a new soldier." Annie grinned, eyes fluttering closed. "You're the best one." As Riley turned off the light and stepped into the hallway, she found Caleb standing there. He reached for her hand, not urgently, not possessively. Just there, warm and quiet. They stood like that for a long moment, hand in hand, surrounded by the stillness of a house that had weathered storms, literal and otherwise. A single soldier, a single dad, a little girl, and the family they didn't know they had built until now. It was the kind of morning where the silence felt sacred. The snowfall had ended in the night, leaving the world wrapped in a soft, white stillness. Light streamed through the front windows of the old house, warm and golden, casting a halo over the wooden floors. For the first time in weeks, the air didn't carry the sharp bite of winter, but something gentler. Something like peace. Caleb stood at the doorway, a cup of coffee in his hand, watching the yard sparkle under the morning sun. Beside him, Riley leaned quietly against the frame, her breath fogging the glass. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Behind them, Annie padded into the room in fuzzy socks and her oversized red hoodie, the one that used to be Riley's. Her curls were messy. A single yellow crayon was tucked behind her ear. "I finished my picture," she announced, holding it up proudly. Caleb knelt down, eyebrows raised. "Can I see?" She handed it over, like it was a treasure. It wasn't perfect. The lines were shaky, the colors mismatched, but the image was unmistakable. 3 people standing in front of a snow-covered house. A little girl in the middle, a tall man holding one hand, a woman in uniform holding the other. Caleb's voice was soft. "Is this us?" Annie nodded. "It's our forever family." Something caught in Riley's throat. She crouched down beside them, eyes misting. "Annie," she said, voice barely a whisper. "Where did you learn to say that?" The little girl smiled. "I heard you tell Daddy you weren't going anywhere, so I wanted to draw it." "Daddy." Riley's eyes met Caleb's. He hadn't flinched. He just smiled soft, quiet whole. It was a name he had never dared hope to wear fully again. But hearing it now from her, it settled something deep inside him. He reached out and pulled them both into a hug, wrapping his arms around the only things that mattered. "Forever sounds about right," he murmured. That afternoon, Riley stood in the doorway of what had once been the guest room. Now it was hers. Not because she was a guest, but because she was staying. She had started moving her things in just a duffel bag, a few folded shirts, a picture frame she hadn't looked at in years. And beside it, she'd placed Annie's drawing on the nightstand, carefully pressed under a sheet of glass. Caleb knocked gently and stepped in. "I was thinking," he said, hands in his pockets. "This room's too cold. Gets the worst of the wind. You sure you don't want to switch to the one across the hall?" Riley turned to face him. "I like this one. It creaks." "So do I," he chuckled. "Fair enough." A moment passed, then he stepped closer. "I'm not good at saying things the right way," he said, "but I want you to know, the day you showed up on that porch, I thought it was just a fluke, a snowstorm, a favor. One day." Riley's eyes didn't move from his, and now she asked. Caleb exhaled. "Now I think it was the first real day of my life again." Riley's voice was soft. It was mine too. He reached for her hand, gentle like asking permission. She didn't hesitate. Their fingers laced together, and everything unsaid fell perfectly into place. "You sure you want this?" he whispered. She smiled. "I'm not just staying for Annie. I know. I'm staying for you." A few weeks later, as the last of the snow melted, the 3 of them stood outside a for sale sign freshly pulled from the lawn. Not theirs. The one next door. "I still can't believe it," Caleb muttered, watching the moving truck rumble away. Mr. Jenkins finally retired, Riley said, holding Annie's hand. And he gave us that old tractor he always swore he'd die on. Annie giggled. Now we can plant sunflowers, Riley raised an eyebrow. You sure about sunflowers? Annie nodded hard. They follow the sun. Just like we follow love. Caleb blinked. Where'd you hear that? I made it up. Annie beamed. But it sounds smart, right? Riley bent down and kissed the top of her head. Brilliant. They stood for a while watching the wind ruffle the branches, listening to the quiet hum of the world starting over. The old house behind them didn't feel cold anymore. It didn't feel lonely. It felt alive. Caleb turned to Riley. Do you miss it? The uniform. The routine. She looked at him for a long moment. No, she said. Because I finally understand something they never taught us in the field. What's that? That courage doesn't always look like battle gear or standing alone. Sometimes, it looks like letting someone in. Caleb smiled. Then I guess we're both finally brave. She rested her head against his shoulder. No, she whispered. We're finally home. That night, as Annie slept upstairs and the fire crackled in the hearth, Riley and Caleb sat on the porch swing, wrapped in an old quilt. The stars were out. The kind of stars that didn't need a telescope to impress you, just a little stillness and someone to share them with. I was never supposed to stay, Riley murmured. I was never supposed to fall in love again. She looked at him. And yet, here we are. He nodded. Maybe that's the miracle, he said. The unexpected kind. Riley reached out, tracing a constellation in the air. You think she remembers her real mama? She asked. Caleb's voice was quiet. I think she remembers being loved. And I think that's enough. Riley nodded. Then we'll keep showing her what that looks like. And maybe, he said, eyes warm, we'll remind each other too. The porch creaked gently beneath them. The stars watched in silence. And somewhere deep inside the house on a shelf, Riley didn't yet know he'd made for her, sat Annie's picture. 3 figures, 1 family, 1 forever. And sometimes, family finds us when we least expect it. In a snowstorm, on a porch, or in the quiet moment when someone chooses to stay.